This is Brian Daitzman, and I'm editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist and host of History of the Present, a long-form interview series co-produced by The Intellectualist and Lincoln Square. History of the Present examines the forces reshaping our world in real time, including democracy, institutional power, technology, media, inequality, and the changing relationship between the citizens and the state. Today, I'm joined by Aaron Rupar, a journalist, and published a public notice where he covers American politics, media, and the Trump movement. Aaron also lives in Minneapolis and reported an Operation Metro Surge, a ICE operation that was promoted by President Donald Trump against the city of Minneapolis during his second term. Aaron covered Operation Metro Surge as both a journalist and resident of the city. In December 2025, the Trump administration launched Operation Metro Surge, with the Department of Homeland Security described as an unprecedented immigration enforcement deployment. Thousands of federal personnel eventually operated across Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding region. The operation produced mass arrests, organized civic resistance, constitutional litigation, allegations of racial profiling, and the unlawful detention and deaths of Americans, including Renee Good, Alex Pretty, two American citizens. Today, we are examining what happened. Why did Minneapolis become the focal point? And what this episode really reveals about current immigration policy, federal power, and the promise of democracy and constitutional law, democratic resistance in today's republic. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My pleasure to join you.
Of course. Aaron, what I want to do is I want to put on a clip really quick to get this going. I'm first going to start with the vice president. I'm sure you recall this clip in an interview with the Daily Mail. If we can cue that up. And I'd like to start with this. Can we start with this?
Plan to apologize to the family of Alex Pretty.
For what?
For, labeling him an assassin with ill intent.
Well, again, I just describe to you what I said about Alex Pretty, which is that he's a guy who showed up with ill intent to an ICE protest.
No, but if it's determined that his civil rights were violated by this FBI investigation, will you apologize to that?
So, if this hypothetical leads to that hypothetical leads to another hypothetical,
it's a real case.
Will I do a thing? And again, like I said, we're going to let the investigation.
Aaron, sort of seeing that and understanding the effects of these deaths. I mean, how does that feel? You're a journalist from this city, and these are people you might not have known them, but they're neighbors. I mean, how does that make you feel? First, as an American, also as a journalist, hearing that from the vice president.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember that clip, and one of the things that I had forgotten is that was actually a Daily Mail interview, which is interesting because they're usually pretty sycophantic toward the Trump administration. So that was actually a pretty decent question. But yeah, I mean, it's it's still kind of it's aggravating, frankly, to hear that still, even after all these months. And the Operation Metro Surge here was such a intense period of time in January. In some ways, it feels like it was a long time ago, even though it was obviously still just this year. But really made us feel like we were under direct assault here, and that there was certainly an aspect of it that felt like an occupation, where we were in. I live in a part of town that there was a lot of activity kind of around us, but not necessarily in our neighborhood. And Minneapolis, like a lot of cities, you can be in one part of town and then drive a few blocks in a given direction and be in a minority neighborhood, a Latino neighborhood, a Somali neighborhood, a Hmong neighborhood. But these neighborhoods are kind of interconnected with each other. So, it wasn't like they were targeting one specific area of town. But even here in South Minneapolis, there are pockets really close by. So I would hear the whistles that people would be blowing, if they saw ICE or if they saw an ICE vehicle, to kind of alert neighbors. So we could hear that, almost every day, just in my house through the windows, or if I went outside. And there was just a sense of you'd see ICE vehicles driving around, and just kind of knowing what they were all about and sort of the menace that they represented, especially, of course, after things got violent. And Renee Good being the first who was murdered, and then Alex Pretty a couple of weeks later. And there was also a shooting in North Minneapolis, which it's since emerged that the ICE agents who perpetrated that lied about what had happened, and are now being prosecuted, or I think we're even being disciplined, internally by DHS, which is kind of shocking for lying as brazenly as they did. But yeah, it was really unlike anything I'd experienced before in my life in that way, just that it felt like we were kind of occupied, and that there was a very hostile force among us, that, they outnumbered the local police. So there was kind of a feeling of helplessness where, I think the police generally here, the local police did a good job kind of making sure protesters were safe and trying to the extent possible to maintain order. As Bavino and his thugs were kind of, going around town to various gas stations and harassing people. But yeah, really kind of made this place feel like a very inhospitable place for a while. And, I guess the silver lining is that coming out of that and even during it, the community really came together and there was so much organization that took place, like in Signal chats, just to alert neighbors about what was going on, or organize, ride shares for kids whose parents were at risk. If they showed up at school, maybe they would be deported or detained. And so, people are really there for each other. But I don't wish that upon anyone. And, I think part of the reason that we were targeted, there's of course the whole backstory of Trump and his hatred of Somalis, Ilhan Omar and Tim Walz. But, there's also a respect in which I think the scale really worked for the type of occupation that DHS wanted to do, where, we're a large metro, but we're not the size of like a Chicago, where it felt like they just didn't have enough force to really kind of impose any sort of occupation on a city of that scale. But here, with just a few thousand ICE agents and Border Patrol, they outnumbered the police, even combined across all the different communities in the metro area. And so they, it was the right kind of scale for them to impose an occupation. But I think the political blowback was so severe that, they kind of tucked their tails and ran away in February.
Oh, I'm curious, Aaron, when did the residents of Minneapolis or the surrounding area, when did they realize that this was not just going to be a series of target arrests, which, had been ongoing, but a much larger, a far more sustained operation that was really focused on disrupting the city in general?
That's a good question. And speaking for myself, there was definitely a quality of like the proverbial frog boiling in the water, where I don't think there was like a specific moment where it was like, wow, we're really, in the shit here. It just kind of ramped up slowly, to the point where somewhere along the way, I installed all the different apps. I had this app called Ice Out, which, it's like community sourced sightings of ICE or vehicles, or people would post videos in there if they saw someone being detained, or, if they saw a misconduct incident, they would post the footage there and provide any information that they could about, the officers involved. So, I started really paying attention to all of the different incidents, after it was already getting pretty bad here. That, there was a sense, and I'm trying to kind of reconstruct this off the top of my head, but, of course, we all remember the Nick Shirley video where he went to, a Somali daycares and was kind of harassing people, to advance this narrative of like widespread fraud among that community. And I think that was in late December.
And then you saw,
and then it was around that time that Tim Walz announced he wouldn't be running again. Because at first the Shirley video really gained a lot of traction and did some political damage for Democrats. But then right on the heels of that, as soon as the calendar turned to 26, I remember, first kind of anecdotally hearing that there were more ICE agents around town, and then kind of the sightings picking up, and communities getting organized to really, get the whistles and blow whistles when ICE agents were around to alert people. And it wasn't too long after that Renee Good was killed. And of course, by then, we knew that it was really going to be quite bad. And then, that was the middle part of January. And I think, Alex Preddy was like 10 days later. So that was really the darkest stretch, was kind of mid to late January. But again, it, kind of ramped up slowly. And then all of a sudden, it was like ICE agents were everywhere.
Why do you, and Nick Shirley, I recall he did a number of these videos, which unfortunately were reposted by some very large accounts on social media, making all these really ugly, derogatory claims against other Americans. Why do you think his videos motivated or appeared to encourage at least some of these government actions?
Well, in total fairness, there has been an issue here with, as there have been in a lot of communities coming out of COVID, where there was a lot of government spending without a ton of like oversight all the time. So that like the fraud thing is a real problem here. And, even being friends with a lot of people who work in Democratic politics, like there's still people concerned, even this election cycle, that it could end up being kind of bad for Democrats. So I don't want to kind of pretend that was like a non-issue, but, these allegations and some of the, the prosecutions have been out there for years, which was kind of one of the misnomers that people had, was like all this fraud wasn't covered. No, there had been many dozens of people who had been prosecuted. This had been kind of an evolving story really since like 2021, 2022 here. So it wasn't brand new in the way that like Nick Shirley or Trump would have you believe, or Vance, that all this fraud was uncovered. That really wasn't the case. Most of the stuff they were talking about had been known and reported locally here years in advance. But I think it kind of sort of affirmed this idea that was out there that the Somali community is kind of like freeloading and they're not really bringing value and they're defrauding the taxpayers, and Ilhan Omar isn't on it, and it's this big conspiracy, and what did Tim Walz know, what did Keith Ellison know? And so it kind of fed those right-wing narratives that of course get heavy play on the Foxes and the Newsmaxes and the Benny Johnson shows of the world. So I think that's what really kind of made it super viral to begin with, and of course it was all over X and it was all over right-wing TV. And then, I think that, part of the inspiration, and I guess I'm kind of projecting into what people in the Trump administration were thinking, but was to kind of go after the Somali community here. And so that seemed kind of like the proximate cause. But then, of course, the people who really ended up in the crosshairs in a lot of instances were Latinos, or even, obviously the people in the, white people like me who were allies of theirs in the community who tried to stand up, when Latinos were targeted or when Somalis were targeted. So as I'm kind of linking that together, I think the Shirley stuff kind of took off because it really kind of portrayed the Somali community in particular in an unflattering light, which is something Trumpers have been inclined to do for many years anyway, and sort of provided that sort of pretext to basically send in the goons to round people up.
I mean, wasn't it pretty apparent that these were not so there's a sort of idea of federal agents. They're maybe in the movies, they come in, they're wearing suits and they look professional, right? And I don't know, maybe that's the FBI. When you call them goons, how are they acting like goons?
Well, there were a number of videos that were circulating. I mean, in addition to the ones that we've all seen of, the officer who killed Renee Good, calling her a bitch, and just there were a lot of videos kind of that we all saw Bavino, throwing pepper grenades at people, and the comments. I think it was actually a clip from California earlier before the Minnesota stuff where Bavino said something about like, this is our town, we're going to kick their asses and stuff like that. So I mean, there's kind of like a brown shirts vibe to that, right? Where it's like this sort of quasi state force, but almost like a militia. Yeah, like a paramilitary force. But then, there was also videos I remember seeing of course, here in Minnesota, eventually people figured out the hotels that they were staying at. And so there were a lot of clips that got heavy circulation of like people demonstrating outside the hotels and making noise and like just drawing attention. And then there was one video I remember of an ICE agent who was like up, in a stairwell where there was a window looking down at the demonstrators and like mooning them, or like flicking people off. And so there's just kind of a lack of dignity among the whole force of ICE and CBP in a way that, cops can behave like that sometimes too, but it seemed like almost more in your face and kind of like less restrained. And, it almost kind of felt, which I think was part of the idea, that they're given kind of carte blanche to sort of be their worst selves and to kind of, terrorize people. So that was a different element. Of course, Minneapolis in particular has a long history of strife between police and the community here. I mean, George Floyd being obviously the paramount example of that. But, I remember when I was covering local issues here, like around 2010, 2011, 2012, there were a lot of police shootings in the news at that time. And it was a little bit before like all of them were on camera, like the George Floyd one was, which I think was a big part of the power of that you could see what happened and how unjust it was. So, police here have never really been held on a pedestal, and, it's always been kind of fraught as it is in many big cities. But even with that being the backdrop, the conduct of ICE and CBP was like a level worse than that and much more egregious just in terms of how hostile they were to the actual residents here.
And would you say, Aaron, that attitude was probably reflected from the top down, right? When the president or the vice president, right, they have these huge, they have the bully pulpit, right? And they say dehumanizing things like we just heard. The president is, he shares these racist cartoons. He says racist things. He enjoys saying things that are, I think most adults would probably say are incredibly hateful. How much of ICE, the behavior towards the citizenry, do you think is traceable to the overall attitude of this government right now, this administration?
Oh, I think a lot of it is. I mean, it's a little bit of a different thing, but it's related where, right after the Preddy shooting, if you remember, Kristi Noem had a news conference where she was like, he was trying to, I think her quote was something like he was trying to massacre ICE agents or something, where it was just so, the line was so over the top and like so demeaning, not just to the victim, of course, but also to like the victim's family and his friends, where, kind of smearing him, someone who was just out there trying to kind of stand up for his neighbors as like this, potential like mass shooter of cops or something like this. I mean, it was so ridiculous. Then of course, it turned out he lawfully had his weapon, and of course, he wasn't brandishing it at all, and so it just became, it's so over the top and insulting and kind of scary in a way that, I mean, it discredits the whole thing. But obviously, someone like Kristi Noem, who was in charge at that point, or even Bavino, who echoed a lot of those same talking points about how the officers hadn't done anything wrong, and if they just would have complied, this wouldn't have happened, sort of stuff. Nobody in this community thought that those people, those officials, were looking out for the interests of people here, or actually really had any, regard whatsoever for, how people are doing here. It was all, trying to kind of own the libs and make a example out of these Democrats in Minnesota and the Somali community. And so, again, that's where it really had kind of a different flavor than anything I've experienced in my entire life, where, it was like an occupying hostile force here. And, even when things went sideways, we couldn't even get the satisfaction of knowing that they would not, not just, telling the truth is one thing. I mean, the type of lies that they were telling were just so outrageous that, almost kind of took your breath away watching those initial press conferences. And I wasn't surprised by that, but there's still something after that's very kind of gives you whiplash when you watch those videos and you understand what happened, and then you hear people sort of lying about it. And I think that led to, that led eventually to her ouster, because, I think nationally people weren't going to accept that.
Yeah, I mean, the over the top lying, the attacking the victim, that's all sort of, I think, probably part of the standard Trump playbook. And I mean, for the city experiencing this, what has been the after effect? So this was a very traumatic. It's been about I don't know, I think 5 or 6 months since the surge has been over. And how, in retrospect, is the city doing now? And do you think that the people of Minneapolis, not necessarily Minnesota, but the people of Minneapolis, do you think that they're going to remember this going into the voting booth in November?
Yeah, so in terms of how the city is doing, I have been in touch with a number of city officials here where, the economic damage was like real and quite extensive in terms of lost business. Like it really took a bite out of the economy during a time of year which is already kind of slow here, like the dead of winter when it's often, well below zero and people aren't really traveling here. So I'm sure that's had some repercussions and is continuing to be felt today. It's kind of been unfortunate because, we sort of had like the triple whammy here of like COVID, George Floyd, and then the ICE stuff, where like, I think we were hit harder by COVID than a lot of metros here, just because like, COVID was hard enough, but then with George Floyd and like the unrest that kind of came on the heels of that, and just sort of the total breakdown of relationships between law enforcement and the community, it just kind of made that even worse, and then to have this ICE thing not that long after that, it feels like the city has never really kind of bounced back from all of those different things. And, it just kind of exacerbated that. In terms of the second part with voting, it's a little bit hard to say because Minneapolis is so blue anyway that it's like we're very civically engaged and very blue here. So, it's interesting as I pay attention to local races, and there's obviously a Senate race this year. There's a governor's race this year. There's a number of hotly contested House races this year that, I don't think it was like a game changer. I think that a Republican hasn't won statewide here now in 20 years. And, I don't think they're going to win this year. It's not impossible, that they sneak out one of these races, but it doesn't feel like it led to like a major reorientation more broadly, because we still kind of have this dynamic, as a lot of states do, where Republicans basically kind of run against the city here and kind of paint the cities as like these hellholes of crime and corruption. And then you have, the very blue cities, which have a population mass that can kind of like override the more outstate and rural areas. And so it seems like we have a stasis where it's about like 55-45 here in favor of the Democrats. And that's why Republicans have been able to win. But I still feel like that's kind of where we're at. And I don't think the ICE stuff really kind of like changed the equation on that a whole lot.
Aaron, so I've been following your work, and I imagine many of our audience have too for a while online, and you've been essentially basically historically chronicling the Republican Party, politics, and particularly President Donald Trump. I want to say for at least possibly a decade. I might be wrong, but around that. And I recall during the 2024 race where you sort of kind of came out and said, listen, I'm a father, I've got children. I'm really concerned that Trump, if he gets back into office, he's going to do horrible things. And this is beyond me even being a journalist. And I remember you said something to that extent.
Yeah.
And then obviously he won, right? Has the Trump administration's actions meant where you thought this could go, or is it above, or has he met your expectations?
That's an interesting question. I would actually say that I think it's probably worse than I thought. I mean, obviously the first term was a complete horror and, kind of capped off by COVID, which was a nightmare in which Trump made way worse than it had to have been. And, it felt like I remember thinking, that Saturday after the 2020 election, when, basically Biden was kind of confirmed to have been the winner, when all of the challenges kind of petered out in the various states, like, I just remember kind of that feeling of such relief, but kind of like this feeling of like we were so lucky to survive that. And then, little did I know that, January 6th was on the horizon and, it was going to get worse before it got better, basically. But that whole period to me, I just remember having that feeling, of like, wow, we got through this. It was really ugly. And that was part of the thing that was so hard for me to process, in the heels of 2024, the election, where it was just like I couldn't believe that we had done this again to ourselves, because, I mean, the Biden administration had a lot of faults.
1.2 million people died during the pandemic.
Yeah.
A lot of the behaviors, a lot of the very dangerous behaviors were encouraged during the Trump administration. Obviously, that carried in. And then obviously you have a failed coup attempt on January 6th, where around 145 police officers were injured. And then you had 7 deaths related to the attack on the Capitol. You chronicle right-wing propaganda, so you probably understand how this happened again. But when the history of this era is written, Aaron, how do you think networks like Fox or OAN, Newsmax, how do you think historians will see them and their effect on our democracy?
Well, I mean, I certainly think they'll, by any fair-minded historian, be viewed as very toxic, sources of misinformation and kind of like poisoning the public debate. I will say that I think, the media landscape is shifting in such a way where, I feel like Fox kind of has their audience and Newsmax kind of has their audience. They're typically kind of older people. I don't think they're gaining a lot of new viewers, and some of that is that they're kind of playing the hits for the boomers, but some of that is just the way that people are consuming news and information. People are going to independent sources, or they're going to TikTok or Instagram or, social media. And there's been obviously a decline in the type of news that like our parents would have consumed, in the 80s or 90s, TV, cable, that sort of thing. So I think we're kind of on the tail end of like Fox being this crucial source. Although, it was interesting to me just yesterday and today, how the Murdochs kind of cooked up this smear on Mamdani pertaining to September 11th, where there was this thing about like the 9/11 families don't want Mamdani to go to the memorial services. And Judd Legum, a colleague of mine and former boss, who now is independent as well, he actually called the guy who organized the petition, and it turned out that the guy was like this raging Islamophobe, and there weren't actually any families. It was just individuals who signed the petition. But this was a story that appeared in the New York Post that then got taken up by Fox, and they had, breathless coverage of it. Then Mamdani ends up being asked about it. And just before he hopped on the call, Trump was asked about it. So you can kind of see how like even something that's so thinly sourced and exaggerated, the traditional right-wing media still has the power to kind of launder those narratives into the news cycle. So I don't want to kind of pretend that it's like a spent force or anything like that. But, I thought that, during Trump 1, the role that Fox was playing was very novel at that point, as kind of like a mouthpiece for the administration. And of course, like he plucked all of his talent, from Fox into his administration, which has continued in the second term with Pete Hegseth, and even Monica Crowley is one of the spokespeople for the State Department. There's a bunch of cast of characters that came from that Fox landscape, but I don't think it's like super influential in and of itself. It is to the extent that like some of the narratives that get propagated there are then picked up elsewhere, or they, end up being the subject of questions that are asked to members of Congress. And then they kind of, become even more newsworthy once like people start weighing in on them. So, it is still, the way that those networks function is quite outrageous. But like the other thing that I think is notable is that there's been a complete breakdown in the separation between like Republican members of Congress and podcasters and like influencers. It's all kind of like the same, category of people. Someone like Sean Parnell.
Cruz, you say, are they an entertainer? Are they a lawmaker? Are they a lawyer?
Right. Well, and we're talking on the same day where the Fauci, to kind of link it back to the COVID thing. Fauci was testifying for the Senate today, and he took the fifth, so he wouldn't say anything. But some of the questions that Republicans were asking, where you had Ron Johnson saying that the vaccine injured are basically committing mass suicide, that there's been this rise in suicides among vaccinated people, which he calls the vaccine injured. But it's like somehow COVID made us even dumber in terms of public health. And like, Trump, instead of learning lessons from the fact that he was president during that time, is way worse on public health. Yeah, it's way worse than it ever was before. Yeah. And then you had a guy like Bernie Moreno, who was dropping F-bombs at Fauci. And that's what I mean, where it's like, this guy could be a right-wing podcaster. He could be like a shock jock on AM radio. But now these are the people that Republicans elect to like the highest offices that we have. And so it's just become like, it's just like, it's just like a big swamp of right wingers. And, some of them are members of Congress, some are on Fox, some are on podcasts, but like, there's no real like hierarchy of professionalism or dignity among these people. It's like, the fact that they kind of debase themselves and make a mockery of their offices is like part of the job description now.
Yeah. I saw that today. Obviously, Dr. Fauci, he was operating in an emergency environment with a novel virus. And he was working with a president who publicly demonstrated no respect for scientific expertise, no respect for public health mandates, and actively undermined those public health mandates, and then lied to the public about the nature of the virus, according to interviews released by Bob Woodward. Do you think that after Donald Trump, he's not going to live forever. No one lives forever. Do you think after Trump is no longer at the top of the GOP, what happens to this party that has, in essence, gotten rid of anyone who could challenge him? Very similar to Vladimir Putin's Russia, where there's no Aaron waiting, right? What happens to the GOP after there's really no Aaron waiting? He has gotten rid of anyone who could really challenge him. I'm just curious your thoughts on that, Aaron.
I'm really excited to get there, and it's going to be there kind of sooner than we think, because, we're going to get through the midterms, and then everybody's going to be kind of obsessed with 2028. I can see that already kind of like happening and kind of percolating in the discourse.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, because, you're right that, something the Democrats should take a little bit of comfort in is just the fact that Trump isn't going to be on the ballot anymore, and that, he has this demonstrated ability to get kind of low engagement people to go out and vote for him. And, he has a certain charisma among conservative people or like right-leaning people where for whatever reason they find him endearing or kind of like authentic, and you can't really force that, if you don't have it. And I think we've already seen that Rubio doesn't really have it. He's tried. I don't think JD Vance has it. Now, I still don't really want to I don't want to be too kind of sanguine about this, because of course 2 years ago Republicans were campaigning on they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, and they won, everything. So I thought that choice in 2024 was very clear, and obviously it wasn't, and I was too optimistic about that. And so I don't want to be like, because things are so bad and Republicans are getting blamed, because they have all the power and people don't like the economy, and people don't like the war in Iran, and they don't like kind of the erraticness of Trump and the fact that he's like all up in their face every day. I don't want to conclude from, or kind of infer from that Democrats are going to clean up this year, because I think that the propaganda works. And even sometimes when it seems really dumb to yourself or myself, like for whatever reason,
it makes sense to someone.
It resonates, and you have to at least kind of leave your mind open to those possibilities.
For some of the, you brought up a good point about the cats and the dogs, and I think Americans really got an understanding of who J.D. Vance was during that whole scandalous controversy where they were falsely accusing Haitian Americans of eating cats and dogs. My question is, Vance, and there's all this sort of horse race which between Vance and Rubio supposedly in the press. Vance doesn't have this sort of, and I'll use quote charisma of Donald Trump, because Trump to some does have charisma. How does Vance figure into all this, into the second term?
I think people on the left of the political spectrum are a little bit inclined to underestimating Vance. I think we saw a little bit of it during the 2024 campaign, where the fact that the vice presidential debate kind of went like it did, I think Tim Walz bears a lot of responsibility for that. But, J.D. Vance is kind of a smooth bullshitter. And he's the type of guy who can kind of, lie very brazenly in a way, with kind of like a smirk. I mean, even that clip that you played at the top of the show where, he's asked if he would apologize to the victims' families if it turned out that their civil rights were violated. And I remember that clip because you can almost see a little gleam in Vance's eye, where it's like he kind of knows that he's full of shit, but there it is, like he's saying it anyway. And I do think that is something that appeals to a lot of people on the right, kind of the, getting one over on the libs and being unapologetic and having kind of a gleam in your eye when you do it. Now, is that enough for him to win like a general election? I'm not sure about that. But, a lot of that oppo was out there on Vance 2 years ago, the whole like cat ladies thing. And, a lot of the comments he had that were very kind of regressive in terms of his views on women and just kind of, cultural mores and things like that. And it wasn't enough to be like a deal breaker, even to prevent him from getting on the ticket with Trump. And, of course, he won in a year in Ohio in 2022, which that wasn't a great situation, obviously, for Democrats, but Trump wasn't on the ballot and he was able to win that year, and that's difficult for Republicans to win when Trump isn't on the ballot. So, I don't want to like totally dismiss him, but I do think he doesn't quite have the same charisma that Trump does among the Republican base. And, I guess my hunch, though, kind of very broadly, is that whoever Trump coronates, I think will end up being the nominee. I still feel like he has enough of a hold over the Republican base that I couldn't really see someone being able to overcome Trump, going after them on social media or kind of rallying his propaganda forces and right-wing media against them. So, but there's also a chance that he maybe, kind of does like a dual endorsement of Rubio and Vance and kind of lets them, fight it out. So, but I mean, because of what we've seen with, the egregious corruption, the criminality, that's all the more reason for Trump to really hold on, have a death grip, on, if not the presidency, at least the Republican Party, so we can kind of use that as a center of power to maintain his own position. But, it's also worth thinking about. I mean, I've heard Josh Marshall advance this theory that when you look at even like the True Social scheme that they're rolling out next week, where they're going to be charging people for first access to the posts from Trump and other market movers, right. It's basically like it's like simulating insider trading. Yeah. But, if Trump wants to keep the gravy train going with schemes like that, that's a really strong incentive not to kind of cede power. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying he's going to like remain president, but like, could he try to coronate Ivanka, where he can kind of keep things in the family or one of his sons? Because once you kind of let that go and it gets to a point where Trump's posts are no longer moving markets because he's not, the president of the United States, then that's going to take money out of his pocket in a way. So I do think that's something worth considering, at least when it comes to the future of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing reporting, and obviously we know about January 6th. We know about his desire to overturn a lawful election that millions of Americans have voted in. So it sort of begs the question, why wouldn't he do it again? He's already said that the reason why he's so corrupt now is that he saw no one cared. He said, "Oh, no one cared what I did." right? So I think he has every incentive to try to do it again, because he has already said that he believes that any race, maybe a federal race, state race, that Democrats win is rigged, and any race that Republicans lose is rigged. Thus, it's only fair if he always wins, right? I don't know how this is going to shake out, to be very honest, for the midterm, because he's giving every indication that he would like to remain in office, or remain in office with a Republican majority. Aaron, I'm curious, you've been around now for a couple speakers of the House, some Democrats, some Republicans. And I imagine you have opinions on many of them. Where does Speaker Mike Johnson, in your opinion, and as a journalist, where do you think he is in terms of respect for his office and belief in the Constitution?
I think he's definitely even lower than Kevin McCarthy, but I think part of that is circumstance, because of course, McCarthy was only speaker when Trump was not president.
Right.
And so, I think part of the thing with Johnson is that he has to kind of contort himself not to contradict Trump, because all it would take would be Trump to post a true social screed kind of saying, it's time for new leadership. And that'd be the end of Mike Johnson. So he has to kind of, make these absurd comments about how, I'm too busy to see the thing that Trump said about, ending Iranian civilization, or, he's making billions from crypto. I haven't read that report yet, So, I mean, it's completely pathetic, obviously. And, when you look at the kind of list of accomplishments that Johnson has, I mean, it's basically just kind of doing a tax cut bill, right? Which is sort of, that's kind of all Republicans ever really want to do. But, it's not like he has big legislative accomplishments that he can tout. And he seems very happy sort of abnegating his own power and responsibilities by just ceding authority to the White House, and kind of, the notion of checks and balances is kind of a farce when it comes to hit the Johnson speakership and the Trump administration. So, I mean, being worse than the Kevin McCarthy is an extremely low bar, but I think Mike Johnson easily clears it. And so I'd have to say he's easily, I don't go as far back as like the Hastert days. So, there might be other speakers that are even worse, but at least since I've been paying attention to politics, I think he's the worst one.
And how do you think, the Jeffrey Epstein, the Epstein, the Epstein files, right? We have not yet gotten to the bottom of this. Do you think under this presidency that there's going to be any justice for the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein?
I'd like to be more optimistic than I am, but I'm pretty doubtful. It seems like the cover-up has been kind of successful, right? I mean, there's all these pages that they haven't released. There's indications by some of the redactions that there's probably incriminating stuff for Trump that has not come out yet. But is the well kind of dry at this point? I mean, the survivors, have not really had specific allegations against Trump. And there's some contained in the files, of course, but the ones who are like speaking on TV or kind of going to the Hill and doing events, like, almost to a person, they say, to the extent they've interacted with Trump, that they didn't see him engaging in wrongdoing. So, it seems like the investigation's kind of gotten to a point, at least with the congressional one, where it's sort of interviewing sort of ancillary characters, or, people who aren't like public names. And so like, there's some like, real heads who are kind of following every last development at this point. But, for me, when they bring in witnesses and do these interviews, it's like, unless a lot of them seem, like it's kind of going down like a rabbit hole that doesn't seem super fruitful to me. But, I'm glad they're pursuing all the leads that they have. But, it just seems like with Todd Blanche, in all likelihood being confirmed as Attorney General, he obviously was the person who was flying down to Texas to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell and, sort of shepherded the transfer of her to a club fed situation, which seemed like some sort of quid pro quo, that would happen in exchange for her not spilling the tea about Trump or something like that. So, it might be one of those deals that we just have to live with the knowledge that obviously Trump was implicated and he was really good friends with Epstein. And we've seen the videos of them partying. There's been allegations of misconduct connected to Epstein against Trump that haven't been confirmed. So they're just kind of allegations, but they're one of obviously dozens against him. And, he beyond that, he was found liable of sexual abuse. And I mean, that was another one of the crazy making things about 2024 to me, is even back on the corruption thing too, where it was like, we knew that Trump was super corrupt. I mean, he was selling shoes and Bibles on the campaign trail, right? I mean, that was during the campaign. We knew that he'd been found liable for sexual abuse. And, we knew of the Access Hollywood tapes, like all this stuff is out there. It's like, it's like people kind of want like the one thing that's going to really kind of do him in. And it's just, I don't think that's really how it's going to work. So it's, it's at some point you'd like to think that people think enough is enough. And, maybe like gas is high, maybe that ends up being the thing that does it. But, I do think that Trumpism is kind of, in that sense, is more of it's a symptom of something, a deeper rot, that so many people are okay with this, to the point where, 2016, you could say, okay, well, he won, it was kind of fluky, Hillary was a bad candidate. But then to win a second time, that's where it's no longer something that you can kind of just dismiss. I mean, it really reflects something, kind of toxic about our whole culture.
Aaron, I want to dive deeper into that. What do you think it says? The fact, I mean, we all, not all of us, but many of us remember Access Hollywood. That's where he talks, I want to say, to Billy Bush, who actually was punished. And he made that comment about grabbing women. This was a 2005 video. It comes out 2016, right before the election. And there's this moment where the Republican Party can choose to go forward, right, and go and attach themselves to him, or basically lose the election and walk away, but essentially basically revise the GOP. Who knows what could happen? They obviously went with Trump. What do you think that says about American politics? The fact that some of our political leaders and elites can be so divorced from anything considering normative morality, right? Where it's not only is it not a big deal, it's kind of cheered on.
Boy, yeah, that's a really profound question. And I don't know if I have like really well organized thoughts about that. I mean, I do sometimes think about this issue in the context of like, if you are let's say that you're like a 28-year-old person right now, so you've been voting for 10 years, like Trump is kind of all you've known as an adult, right? Yeah. Like this, and so would that mean that things that for me would have been, when I was that age, like unfathomable for like a mainstream politician to be found liable for sexual abuse and then win a presidential election, or to be selling shoes and Bibles, like some sort of huckster on TV and then win a presidential election, like, so we've normalized like a lot of stuff that is really abnormal and quite horrible. Yeah. And, I put most of the blame for that obviously on Republicans. I think in the Democratic Party, we still have some standards. I mean, I was just reflecting with some friends last night about the Al Franken, resignation and kind of the circumstances leading up to that, and how, like, if that happened today, I think it's like an open question, even if Democrats would have taken that as seriously today, or maybe we'd have more tolerance, since those claims were kind of disputed, and, and some of them didn't, quite rise to the level of like assault or things like that. But, Democrats obviously kind of policed their own ranks and pushed him out when his position became untenable, whereas Republicans kind of celebrate that stuff, right? Or it's like, it makes Trump more authentic, and he's more authentic to them. Yeah. So,
I mean, the fact that the president's son, the president of the United States' son, is buddies with the Tate brothers, right? What were the Tate brothers just indicted for? I believe in the United Kingdom. I believe they were indicted for sex trafficking, child pornography, among other things. And there are reporting suggesting that the Tate brothers received special treatment from the Trump administration because of the son, right? That's something that I want to hope or believe that in any other administration in modern times, that would have been it. And I don't know if you remember this, Aaron, but I remember as a kid, Vice President Quayle in 1992 race, he misspelled potato.
I do remember that. Yep.
And that was, we can't vote for this guy, right? Can't vote for this guy. Trump we know what he's done. He's a felon, right? What happened there? What happened there from 92 to 2015? I really wonder about that.
There's also Some of the things I think were a little unique to Trump, where, he was the celebrity for many decades, even on TV. He was like a tabloid figure. And so I think that was really like a big part of his initial appeal, especially when you stacked him up with the other Republicans that were kind of on offer at that moment. It was kind of a lot of like people, sort of like nobodies really, like a Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio. And I mean, these weren't exactly household names. Then you had Trump, who I think activated a lot of people who might not have been engaged with politics otherwise. And, and this is, I guess maybe we could have a separate show about this, but like, you think back on like those 2015 debates, and like Trump was pretty quick-witted. He was like kind of filleting these guys on the debate stage and, kind of running circles around them and humiliating them. And, it did actually legitimately make for good entertainment, because at the time it didn't seem like the stakes were that high, right? It was like, well, he's this buffoon and, maybe he'll even be the Republican nominee, but no way will he win the presidential election. But, so there was something kind of unique about Trump that I'm not sure if it was just some random guy, if it was Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, I don't think they would have gotten away with as much as Trump has, because that's kind of part of the celebrity, that he was sort of this bad boy, and, he had been married all these different times and, philandering with different women. And, people kind of gave him grace on that, because that was part of like the celebrity that was Donald Trump. And nowadays we think of him as being more of a political figure, right? But in 2015, it was like, here's this reality TV star running for president. So I think that's damaged him, that he's more associated with politics now, and kind of he can't claim to be an outsider or like something different anymore. I mean, he's kind of remade the whole party in his image.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to understand what so many of these people who have tied themselves to the president. 10 years, 20 years from now, I imagine going to be a lot that comes out that we don't know that has happened in the first Trump presidency, that may have happened between the presidency. And then obviously this second term has been, I think it's fair to call a crime spree in the White House. And so it's very curious to really understand how these same lawmakers, some of these lawmakers who may have been attacking Dr. Fauci today, how they will position themselves 10, 15, 20 years when there's a photo of them and President Trump, and probably more comes out, and we're not going to have as much incentive, or the right wing media, whatever it is, in whatever form it is, because it will almost certainly be different than today, to essentially propel him. Just like there was a moment, I want to say, in American politics from the 9/11 all the way, I almost just want to say, to the end of the Obama administration, where it was considered impolite to criticize the Iraq War, right? And then all of a sudden, Trump says it. I remember that was his moment in the 2015 debate, where you had Jeb Bush there, who was defending his brother with the Iraq War, and then Trump, and he was lying. He said, "I was always against the Iraq War." He that's not true, but the willingness to say that was what got him. I want to say that's what really kind of got people's attention, because he was willing to go against what was the Republican orthodoxy at the time. How do you think that in general, with the Democratic Party, you said that, Republicans might not be popular right now because they get ownership of a lot of the choices, or their lack of choices that they're making, but they get ownership of a lot of choices because of what the president does. At the same time, that doesn't translate necessarily into love of Democratic Party. Can you speak to that? What is we have a sort of a bipartisan system, right? It's Democrat, Republican. Obviously, we have independents. Where do you see the Democrats right now?
It's been a tough spot for them the last couple of years, where when you have no power, there's a thirst obviously for action and for like real accountability, and putting up meaningful checks and balances on Trump, but they haven't really had the tools to do that, and I was very harsh on Schumer with how he handled, the shutdowns, one late last year, one this year. But, in hindsight, I think politically, maybe his analysis was somewhat on point, where he tried to make Trump kind of own the healthcare issue with some of the spiking premiums, and it seems like that's an issue that is a real strong one, policy wise for Democrats heading into this cycle. So maybe that'll still pay dividends, but I don't know. I mean, it's tough to kind of paint with too broad of a brush because we don't really have a party leader, which is a very natural thing when you lose an election like the 2024 election. And, we'll get to a spot a year from now where we will have some leaders because it'll be whoever the top contenders are in the primary, and then, we'll have kind of a more organized set of ideas to organize ourselves around. I mean, certainly I think someone like Mamdani has been really effective in making affordability kind of like a big, sort of an issue that Democrats can own. And that sort of transcends the culture warring that Republicans want to always be doing, just to stay focused on actually delivering for people. That's maybe easier to do in a city like New York, which is very blue than it is in, purple states where you have to try to build a coalition that includes some conservatives. So every constituency in that way is a little bit different, or every district that someone is running in is different. But, I just think, it's tough right now to talk too broadly about Democrats because they're in kind of a bad spot. They don't have power and they don't really have a leader. And I think we're on the cusp of all that changing because we'll get through this cycle. And by all indications, I think it should be pretty positive where Democrats should at least retake the House. And, I think, Maine seems pretty promising at this point for Democrats, and maybe even Texas does too. And so, I think 6 months from now or a year from now, it'll be a very different conversation. But I don't want to be too harsh because I don't think they really have the tools to do the kind of the kind of work politically that people are really hungry for them to do. It just wasn't going to happen when you don't have a majority in either chamber and you don't have the White House, and the courts are stacked for Republicans too.
Right. Aaron, what are you working on? What are you working on at Public Notice? I mean, why don't you talk about your publication and let people understand what your focus is and really what you're writing about now.
Yeah, so, I'm really happy these days to work with some fantastic contributors. I think we have a real strength in kind of like legal affairs where, today we did an explainer on Harmeet Dillon and how she kind of embodies this tendency that we see across the Trump administration, especially in the DOJ, though, of like wanting to be a troll on the internet. And so you tweet all this like insane stuff, but then in a court of law, when you come before a judge who's kind of like more sober minded, it can really backfire. And so the piece today that's on the homepage kind of gets into a consent decree that the DOJ in the pre-Trump era reached with Portland police over some misconduct allegations, and how Dillon has kind of tried to weaponize that consent decree to implement some of Trump's priorities, even though otherwise they hate these consent decrees and have kind of backed out of them in other contexts, but they're trying to use it as leverage basically over the city of Portland, and how a judge kind of rejected that because Dillon had posted these tweets kind of saying like, we're coming for you now. And, it's retribution. And, sort of saying the quiet part out loud that it wasn't actually like a real legal dispute. It was more of like a political attack. So, we do explainers on topics like that go like a level deeper, not just like Trump is bad, but, talking about how earlier this week we had a piece on the Saudi nuclear deal that was blown up and how that really kind of exemplifies how Trump governs by whim, where even in a case like that, where some of his cronies in the administration did the work to reach a deal that was signed, then he gets involved and kind of blows the whole thing up, adds conditions to it, and how that's not only unworkable in terms of like a model of governance, but it destroys U.S. credibility because any deal that we reach is not worth the paper that it's, that the signature of his is on. So yeah, I mean, I view what we do as kind of explaining what's going on in the administration and in Congress, even kind of more broadly, societally and politically, with a focus on the right wing for a largely left audience. So that's always kind of been, a hallmark of my work is, kind of bringing some clarity to really confusing events for people who don't have the bandwidth to necessarily be as immersed as I am in it day in and day out. And like I said, thankfully, I'm working with some contributors these days who can really add a lot of depth because they have specific expertise that goes beyond what I can do as an individual, but to help me kind of, whether it be legal affairs, whether it be foreign policy, domestic affairs, to really go a level deeper into the policy that's at hand too, not just kind of the optics or like the segments that we can all see on TV.
Aaron, we talk about such heavy stuff here at History of the Present, and curious, what are you optimistic for? And this is my last question. What are you optimistic for in the future, because we're kind of going through a tough time, but a lot of Americans, hope can be very motivating and encouraging, and I'm sure they'd be curious to understand what's something that, hey, I know things are tough, but let's try to keep this in mind, right?
I would say let's look forward to the Republican primary, right? Because I think that's going to be good entertainment of Rubio and Vance and whoever else, and that, again, that's going to be starting up, I think, sooner than people appreciate. Because, I think we are kind of at the end of hopefully what we'll look back as like a very dark period. But, this 2-year period between Trump's inauguration and when the new Congress convenes next January, where, it felt hopeless because we had no power, that it felt like Trump had kind of won, right? Especially in early 2015, where you had all the tech oligarchs, at the inauguration kind of kowtowing to him. And, it felt like the culture had kind of shifted in a way. And I think that proved to be like an overinterpretation of what had happened there. I don't think the culture has really changed. I think Trump is still viewed as being broadly pretty toxic and uncool, and his supporters, being kind of like unsavory characters. And so, I don't know how to process that in terms of how can you explain how we won? And, maybe part of that was kind of like, we could get into like the Biden campaign and Kamala taking over and some of the shortfalls there. But, I would just say that in terms of hope, I think hopefully we're nearing the end of a very dark period, and there are better things in the future where we'll get through this. Hopefully we'll have a Democratic House at least. So there will be at least a check in that respect, that Trump could be impeached. There will be a check on some of the worst legislation that they want to do, or like, investigations will be able to happen because Dems will have the gavel on the committees in the House. So, beyond that, I don't know. I think myself personally, I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing where politics is not my whole life.
Yeah.
And, again, I think I had to kind of do that, especially after 2024, where it was like, I'm done trying to kind of make sense of people. Like, they're going to do what they're going to do. And you make the argument as best you can. You try to explain, for me in my work, like why I think the Trump movement is so toxic and so bad. And like, how a lot of things that he says are just crazy and nonsensical or like hateful. And I try to expose it every day. And then, obviously there are bigger forces at work, and people make the voting decisions that they make. And, and then you just have to live with it. So I try to find meaning in like my individual relationships and kind of my community here. And then I cover this stuff for a living, and I'm obviously highly immersed in it. But I do have optimism, not even just kind of thinking in a motivated fashion or like kind of based on my emotions. I really do think that we'll probably look back on this period that we're in right now as sort of like the worst period. And, hopefully now that we're kind of, Trump's never going to be on the ballot again. I know he likes to kind of tease that he's going to run again, but, so that kind of speaks for itself, right? He has a 2-1 record. He kind of dominated this era going back to 2015, until he leaves office in 2029. This will be kind of the Trump era of politics. But I do, for no other reason than the fact that he's 80 years old and in pretty bad health. It'd be one thing if he was 50, right? There'd be like a real concern, but, and then, there is a concern that whoever the next Republican is will be even worse. I've heard this from people where it's like, Trump is kind of he's showing like where the weak points are. And so someone who is even shrewder, could go even further than Trump. But then you look at the people on offer, and I don't think any of them have the Trump magic. So, if there is someone who's even worse than Trump that comes along, that'll be like 10, 15 years down the line, and I'll be old by then. So, I'll be hopefully thinking about retiring by then.
Well, Aaron, please, everyone, go to Substack, subscribe, follow Aaron, subscribe to Public Notice. It is a great publication. You can learn a lot about our democracy, a lot about the United States from watching this and reading Aaron's articles, his contributors' articles, and obviously Aaron always does a public service. I don't know how he does it, by watching all of these political events, and he then describes it. So, Aaron, I just want to say it was a real honor to have you finally on History of the Present to discuss today, and we would love to have you back on at another time to discuss all these matters and more.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great. We've known each other online for a long time, but it's great to have an extended, kind of, I was going to say face-to-face, but sort of on a screen interaction. But yeah, I'd be happy to do it again. Thanks for having me. And like I said, really nice chatting with you.
Aaron, it's great.
All right. Take care, guys. Are you all good with the upload?